Welcome and thank you so much for coming. My name is Rowan and I am going to be speaking along with Megan. Thank you for joining us at Pinewoods Chapel this evening. So Megan and I are both not experts on emergency preparedness. I just want to say that right up front. But we are both actively working on becoming prepared. And we're not where we want to be yet, but we are further along than we were. And so we are just very excited to share with you some of the things that we've learned, and we hope to encourage you in your emergency preparedness. Sometimes it's hard to know where to start, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Pinewoods Chapel is a church, and for that reason we're going to take a moment just to talk about the biblical rationale for emergency preparedness. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, you may be surprised to know how much is in there on this topic. The Bible is mostly about us learning about Jesus being our Savior, but there's also a lot of great wisdom in there too, and I'm going to share some of that with you now. Emergency preparedness is making sure you have what you need in the event of an emergency. Our grandparents used to call it saving for a rainy day. Put your hand up if you've ever heard that or used that expression. Exactly. Well, rainy days are coming. It's just a matter of when. And so I want to hear from you. What are some emergencies that can come up? So feel free to just say one out and I'll repeat it into the mic so that the recording will record it. Power outages, right, that's a very common one and we will be getting into that. Tornadoes, right, we had one in this town recently, and so that's one that we're going to talk about as well. Yep. Anything else? A pandemic, exactly. So we are recording this in 2022, so we've just been through 2 years of that. Yep, anything else? Floods, that's right, the people in British Columbia have been definitely experiencing that lately. War, exactly, and I think that's on our mind more than ever, for sure. No water, right, so that could mean a drought or that your water supply is unavailable. Yep. Yep. Anything else? No heat, right, and that can be a result of a power outage. And especially living in Canada, having no heat can be very problematic in the winter months. So we will be talking about that. I also added job loss. So most of us are thinking of like natural disasters or grid down situations, but actually job loss is an emergency, can be an emergency if you're not prepared. Thank you, yeah. Yes, yes, so illness can be definitely an emergency, and especially if it's like a catastrophic illness that stops you from being able to work or something like that. So that's another reason why it's really important to be prepared and to have a plan. Exactly, so I had injury or illness as well down as something else, and you've all covered the ones that I had down as well. So a few years ago, our well pump got struck by lightning. Of course, it was when my husband was in Africa. It took several days to get a new pump, and so we were without water for that time. And to be honest, I can't remember if we had a generator or not at the time, but I probably wouldn't have known how to really hook it up to the house and run it. But even if I ran, like it wasn't a power outage, it was actually struck by lightning. So we were without water for several days, even though we have a well. And so I was glad that I had some emergency water stored up, so we were still able to cook and drink water and brush our teeth. But if I hadn't, that would have been problematic for sure. My parents were in the ice storm in eastern Ontario, and I can see we have some people here who were also in that ice storm, and they could tell you of their adventures. They were without power for, I think it was almost 2 weeks, and I couldn't help my parents because they were 6 hours away, and the roads were impassable, and I couldn't help them at all, and I couldn't even reach them, really. Their neighbor had a generator, and they had a natural gas fireplace, and so they were able to survive, but if they hadn't had those things, they would have been without heat altogether, and they would have had hypothermia and frozen to death. Angus, as we mentioned, had a tornado recently, and not only was the tornado an emergency in itself, but it actually took a long time, we found, for insurance companies or even community support, like the money that had raised, still had to go through a process, a bureaucratic process, to be able to get it to the people. And so there's a lag time between when the incident happens and when you get your help. And so that was an emergency that we faced in our town here not too long ago. Many of us lost our jobs or were underemployed due to the pandemic mandates. And often the pandemic required us to isolate in our homes for 2 weeks at a time or longer. So it's important to have a preparation for being sick for 2 weeks or isolating for 2 weeks. If you can't go anywhere, then you need to have some food on hand and some medicine and so on. So that's another thing that has happened recently. And if you own a small business, you probably suffered financial loss during this time, as I have. So my daughter lives in British Columbia, where there has been flooding this year, and supply chain issues and political factors are causing shortages, including food shortages, which will only get worse. And at this time, there is a huge food shortage of baby formula in the United States right now. So apparently one plant is the only FDA-approved plant for making baby formula, and they actually make several of the brands. And so since something came up at that plant that had to be shut down, they can't get baby formula out to American citizens, and the laws in America preclude European baby food from being brought in. People have tried it, and it's been confiscated by border security. So that's a real crisis if you can't feed your baby yourself and you need formula. That's something that is happening right now as we speak. And that's a devastating food shortage when we can't even feed our babies, right? And this is in North America. So these things are happening. And without getting political, just being factual, our own government can now freeze our bank accounts without due judicial process. So that would be an emergency for most of us, if not all of us, if that happened to us. So these are just some of the emergencies that can happen without much warning, and so it is important that we prepare the best that we can. In some ways, I feel like the timing of this seminar is like closing the barn door after the horse has left the building, because we've had just so much in the last couple of years that it would have been good to have this beforehand, but it is never too late to have this conversation, and I'm so glad that you're here to have it with us. It's never too late to prepare. A little bit of preparation is always better than none at all, and even if you're not where you want to be, just take a step, right? And you'll be further along than you were before, as I said earlier. Well, there are a lot of opinions out there on prepping, and there are extremes at both ends, right? From not being prepared at all, or even in religious circles, not being prepared and just trusting God, even though you're not prepared. So that's kind of one extreme, or just being in denial that a rainy day will come. And then there's the other extreme of extreme bunker apocalypse prepping, I call it. And so as I said, since we're having an emergency preparedness seminar at a church, we're going to share some words from the Bible that have been guiding principles for thousands of years. And you might be surprised, as I said, to know what's in there. So the first one I want to share with you is from a letter from the Apostle Paul to Timothy, a young pastor that he was mentoring. He wrote, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind." So this verse will tell you where I believe we are coming from on this topic. Although this verse isn't specifically about prepping, that's where we're coming from. So we're not here to make everyone fearful. We're not here to, go crazy here. We're here to have power, love, and a sound mind that comes from God. And so that should be our mindset as we're thinking about being prepared. So we don't advocate living in fear, but we encourage people to have a sound mind and consider calmly and rationally what is needed, and then make your plans accordingly. All of our plans will be different, and so it's important that we do an assessment of our current risks and needs. And so my needs and risks will be different than your needs and risks, so that's where you have to start. What are we most likely to face? What do we have already? What do we still need to have in order to be prepared? And then not only a sound mind, but also love. You are loving your family when you prepare for an emergency. You are loving your neighbor when you have something with which to help them in time of need. You are loving your community when you are taking responsibility for yourself and for your family, not being a burden on your community so that they can help those who are truly in a crisis. You can make sound decisions when you have what you need for a little while and you don't need to panic. So having some preparation actually buys you time, and so then you're not just reacting, but you have time to think and time to pray and time to act when there's an emergency. A crisis is less of a crisis when you are prepared. You can keep calm and carry on. There's a woman described in Proverbs, which is a book of wisdom in the Bible. She had no need to fear the winter, and she could laugh at the days to come. That is a direct quote from Proverbs, because she had worked hard and prepared food and clothing for her family and her workers. One aspect of this woman's life was that she spoke kindly to people and she gave to the poor. She could give because she worked hard and she was prepared. It was a way of life for her. So she wasn't just preparing only for her family and hoarding up things. She also was able to give to others, and that was how she lived. We can learn from the Proverbs 31 woman. Sometimes God works a miracle in a time of crisis. He used Elijah to extend the provision of oil in the house of a widow to help them get through. The widow had a jar of oil in the first place for him to work with, I would point out. Proverbs 21:20 says, "Precious treasures and oil are in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man consumes everything he has." And I think that's how we usually live in North America, isn't it? We go from paycheck to paycheck and we spend our whole paycheck and we don't really always think about the future. So if we want to be wise, which I think is the real heart of prepping with a sound mind and not out of fear, we need to look at our needs and our wants, and I don't do this perfectly, but I want to, and make sure that we have what we need before we spend on our wants. Then when we have a need, we can pull from our storehouse or from our pantry. This storehouse or pantry allows us to give to others also, or to extend hospitality to others with food. And Megan is going to give us some practical ideas later of how to build your preparedness on a budget later on. So we're practical around here. We're not all wealthy, and so we're going to be hearing about that a little later. Proverbs 27:12 says, "A wise, shrewd person discerns the danger ahead and prepares himself, but the naive simpleton never looks ahead and suffers the consequences." So, if you are prepared and an emergency doesn't happen, you can eat your mistakes. But if you're unprepared and there's an emergency, your mistakes could cost you everything. The way of the world these days is to shift our responsibilities to the government or to other people, but the biblical way is for people to look after their own family members. Then, if someone is in need and has no family, such as a widow or an orphan, the church can help them. Paul told Timothy that if anyone does not provide for his own family, he is worse than an unbeliever. So that's pretty strong language. He also said that believing women are to look after their widowed mothers, and that if a person expects to eat, he should work. Christians can share what they have in a time of crisis, but it is voluntary and joyful. If you don't have, though, you can't share. You may remember the history of Joseph in Egypt. Pharaoh was warned in a dream that famine was coming, so Joseph advised that they store food during the time of plenty, which they did. And not only was Egypt able to survive years of famine, but they were also able to help people from other countries who traveled there to get grain as well. Incidentally, in Egypt, as we speak, they are storing up a supply of grain for their people because they see food shortages approaching because of world events. I hope our government is too, but I don't know if they are. So if you're a Christian, you may be wondering, where does trust come in? We do trust God to care for us. So it's that balance between trusting God to care for us and being diligent to be obedient and follow biblical wisdom and provide for our own. So we don't want to spend so much time on our own preparedness and so much money that we neglect the house of the Lord. We're told that if we are rich in this world, we need also to be rich towards God. So it's important that we remember that. Our trust is not to be in earthly treasure. We're to store up spiritual treasures with God as well. Anything that we have can be taken away from us in an instant, right? Our house full of preps could burn down. We could be robbed. So we need to have that which cannot be taken away from us, which is our faith in God, right? So it's important that we say that when we're talking about a biblical perspective on prepping. But what gives a better opening to your neighbor to learn about the faith? You begging them for food in a crisis, or you offering them some food in a crisis? So I would like you to give some thought to that. So there's so much more I could say. I just wanted to give a brief overview of the biblical rationale for emergency preparedness. Preparedness is such a huge topic. When we were planning this evening, we really had to discipline ourselves because there's so much that could be talked about. Long-term storage, bugging in, bugging out, get-home bags, 72 hours, power outages, each individual bad thing that could happen. So we don't have time for that, and I have my eye on the clock as we speak, but we're going to focus on 72 hours of preparedness because we have to start somewhere, and if you haven't started being prepared, that is a really good place to start. That's 3 days. And we're going to touch on power outages, and then Megan's going to talk, as I said, about prepping on a budget. And we can always have another get-together like this and talk about more topics. So why 72 hours? Public Safety Canada has partnered with the Canadian Red Cross and other organizations to launch a 72-hour campaign asking Canadians to know the risks in their area, make an emergency plan, and develop an emergency kit. There are a few reasons to be prepared for 72 hours. So studies show that most people, if they can make it through the first 72 hours of a crisis, they will probably make it. And so it's good to know that. In preparedness, and this is getting to your handout now if you're wondering when we're getting to the handout, the rule of threes. You can only go 3 minutes without air. You can only go 3 hours without shelter. And that's especially referring to times of extreme cold or extreme heat. You can only go 3 weeks without food. And I think I skipped 3 days without water, which is extremely important. So you need water actually more than you need food. So 3 days without water is a big factor in the starting point. And so the example of just our well pump randomly being struck by lightning, or for most of us, it would be a power outage that would cause us not to be able to get water. So 72 hours is a good place to start for water. So just have some jugs of water. You can fill your own jugs with water or just buy already bottled water. It's a very doable and manageable goal. So they say to have a gallon of water per person per day. That's kind of the rule of thumb. It could be a lot. It depends if you're counting it as also flushing your toilet and you're cooking with it and. And I want you to remember your pets as well when you're having your water prepared. Okay. Yes, so as I said, prepping can be so overwhelming that it's hard to know where to start. And this is breaking our goals down into manageable pieces. After you're prepared for 72 hours, you can then prepare for 2 weeks. And we saw that some of us had to be in our homes for 2 weeks. So that is quite a realistic next step after 72 hours. And then we can do, a month or 3 months and so on. But you got to start somewhere, and 3 days is very manageable for most of us. 2 weeks can give you the time to look for a job before the food runs out if you're laid off. 2 weeks of preparedness can help you reallocate your budget to deal with an unexpected expense or to easily pay for the expense because you have an emergency fund. So we're going to start with 72 hours, and then I hope you will do that and then develop bigger goals. So as I said, we need to assess the risks of our likeliest situations and inventory our strengths and resources. And this is a good time to talk about bugging out and bugging in. So what is bugging in? Bugging in means you're hunkering down in your house, you're sheltering in place. That might be another phrase that you've heard in the last couple of years. Whereas bugging out is when you need to get out of your house quickly and go. And so 72 hours for some people might mean bugging in, but 72 hours of preparedness might mean bugging out. So you have to look at your situation. So Megan and I are good examples. So Megan lives in a subdivision. And so sometimes if you're in a city situation, that can pose different problems and dangers than where I live, which is more of a country working on being a homesteady situation. So for me, other than a forest fire or someone coming at us with guns, there's no reason for me to leave my house in an emergency situation because it's out in the country. It's not like in immediate danger other than if there was a forest fire, like I said, or people with guns. So we have different situations. And so when I'm preparing for 72 hours, I'm not necessarily having bug out bags. I didn't bring them because I've moved 3 times this year. They're in storage, but I have 2 5-gallon pails full of all my 72-hour stuff. And so we can just grab them, put them in the car, and we have relatives that live on farms and nearby. So for us, bugging out would be probably like that, whereas in a subdivision might not be the same situation if you're in a city situation. So then you might be like Megan and have knapsacks for bugging out. So you see how we've assessed our risks differently, and then we have planned and prepared accordingly. All right, so we talked about the importance of water, and when you start to store water for 3 months, that's a lot of water. Where on earth do you put it? So one practical idea, and this is something that we have, is a Berkey water filter. It doesn't have to be a Berkey, but just some kind of water filtration system. So I like to store, some water for a short-term situation, like 72 hours, but I'm not going to store like 100 gallons of water in jugs in my garage. So I have a pond on my property, so a Berkey water filter can actually filter rainwater or pond water and make it drinkable. So for me, in my situation, that is better than storing gallons and gallons of water. And if you're bugging out particularly, there are items like this is a water drop, and it's a water filtration kind of straw, and there's something called a life straw. You can get water bottles that have water filters as well, so you might want to choose something like that if you're bugging out, or before you can upgrade to a Berkey. I don't have a big one, I have the smallest size, but eventually I'd like to have a bigger one. You can also get tablets for water purification as well, and they're very light, and you can keep those in your knapsack. So you need water. That's the most important thing. You need food, breakfast, lunches and dinners, and snacks for each person for 3 days, plus food for pets. So I have little canned cat food for my cat Piper, and it doesn't need a can opener. It just opens, and I have enough for him for the 72 hours. And you may have bigger pets and you might need more stuff, but that's what I have for mine. So don't forget the pets, otherwise you'll be feeding them your food and then you won't have much food to survive. Though my cat caught a rabbit yesterday, so I think he'll be fine. You could eat the pet, but most of us love our pets so much, we hope that it doesn't come to that. And this is a good way to prevent you having to do that. But if it gets really bad, yeah, you might have to. Yeah. So I want to recommend for food in the first 3 days that you don't have stuff that you need to cook. So when we think about prepping, we think of, just have lots of dried rice and beans. And that's good for long-term storage, especially if you actually eat rice and beans. But in the first 3 days, you're probably going to have a power outage. You probably won't have that many ways to cook. And if it's a crisis, you don't want to have to deal with that or learn a new skill. You just want to be able to eat right away. So that's why a can of cooked beans that you can just eat right out of the can without heating up, even if it's not that appetizing, is better than a bag of dried beans. Do you see by the difference? Or one of these pouches of already cooked rice, you can just eat it right out of the bag and it's easy, is better than some rice that you have to cook from scratch. These backpacker meals of freeze-dried and dehydrated are great, but you do have to be able to boil water to use them. So while they're great to have, maybe in the first 72 hours it might not be as good as having something like this chili that is already cooked and ready to go and even has a tab so you don't need a can opener. That might be better than something you have to cook. And then if you're bugging out or you want to have a bag to be prepared in your car, which is another topic, these are known as MREs, and they are like food lab emergency food that you don't need to cook, and it just contains the right amount of calories that you need in your situation, and they don't expire quickly, so you can have them in your 72-hour kit without having to worry about expiry date, like every few months changing it up. Or granola bars sound great, but then how long do they really last in your bag, and how often are you going through your bag? So something like this is good for 72 hours. So food is very important. You want non-perishable, and You might notice that I said snacks. Snacks are important for morale, especially in a crisis, especially if you have kids. So don't forget to put some snacks and goodies in there. Sanitation. Sanitation can be very tricky, especially in a power outage. So what I like to have in my 72-hour kit is baby wipes, and they're so versatile because you can use them to give yourself a sponge bath, right? If you don't have water, you don't have to be gross in an emergency, right? You can just have some wipes, and then you can even use them for cleaning surfaces, just washing your hands, and they store very well, and they're not heavy, and so that's something that I recommend you having on hand, even if you don't have a baby. And if you do have a baby, you definitely need that. And don't forget baby food and toddler food if that's your family. And if you do have an infant, I would highly recommend having some baby formula in emergency storage, because we can see how easily that supply chain can be disrupted. All right, the next thing is medication. So if you're on regular medication, make sure you have a little extra so that during a crisis you have what you need. It's very important. If you're on oxygen or someone in your house is, you need to have like a backup battery, for example, for the oxygen machine. So these are things to consider if you're on regular medication. I would also recommend having some ibuprofen, some Pepto-Bismol, a good first aid kit. At the beginning of the pandemic, I stocked up on fever medication, Gatorade for electrolytes, Buckley's, and chicken noodle soup, because if any of us got sick, I wouldn't want to leave the house and go buy those things. So we had those things on hand just so that we could treat our people in-house unless it progressed to something that needed hospitalization. But just for the average flu or cold or anything, it's good to have those things in your 72-hour or at any time. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a shortage of masks, wasn't there? And even if we didn't sew, we were sewing them or fabric gluing or whatever we had to do to make some. And so I do recommend getting some N95s and putting those in your 72-hour kit. And now you can get them almost anywhere, and they're quite affordable because there isn't a shortage. So it's a good time to get that in your kit. Light and heat, and we'll talk a bit more about this in emergency preparedness for power outages. So light and heat, especially in the winter, especially in Canada, need to be considerations in your emergency preparedness, even for 72 hours. If the hydro goes out, it could stay out for 3 days or more. Any of you have lived rurally in Canada, it's pretty much a regular occurrence that the power goes out for 3 days every so often. So you need to keep warm, and light is even part of your security, as well as just being happy for your home. So this is a good time then to talk about power outages. Before I do, though, does anyone have any questions about the whole idea of 72 hours emergency preparation? It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just having what you need for 3 days, right? Whether you need to take it to go or whether you're going to stay home. I will say that bugging out should be a last resort. This is a whole other topic, bugging out. But when you bug out, you essentially become a refugee, don't you? When you're leaving the security of your home and you're just wandering wherever you're going. So it is the last resort, but it is good to be prepared to do so if you need to. And if you have a good idea of where you're going, that's, important. Otherwise, you will be a refugee. Okay, power outages. This is one of the most common emergencies that we face, or inconveniences, depending if we're prepared. They can happen due to weather, like the ice storm, trees falling, there is a declining infrastructure, and there's even now the risk of cyber attacks, which can cause a grid to go down. So for our purpose, we'll focus on short-term preparedness for power outages because it fits into our 72-hour emergency plan. So heat, let's talk about heat. In the Canadian winter, heat is vital so we don't get hypothermia and die of exposure, so that's important. Put your hand up if you have a wood stove. Okay, so quite a few of us. Yeah, and I grew up in Haliburton, so that's quite far north of here, and firewood was in abundant supply. I don't know anyone who didn't have a wood stove up there, and that's all we had to heat our house with when I grew up. So you can set your home up with a wood stove or a wood furnace. Of course, not everyone can just afford to do that, and you'll find that it's not the actual wood stove and stovepipe that is the costly thing. It's that your insurance goes up if you have a wood stove. Your house insurance goes up. So that is something that is not fun, but it might be worthwhile anyway to have a wood stove if you can. We have an outdoor wood furnace, and so that doesn't affect our house insurance, which is nice. If you have a natural gas or propane fireplace, put your hand up if you have that option. Okay, good, thank you. You can actually get a battery backup ignition, especially if you have a direct vent. And so then your fireplace will still run when the power is out, as long as the gas lines are not compromised or you don't run out of propane. But usually, if it's only 72 hours and it's a power outage, probably you wouldn't run out of propane, but just keep an eye on your levels. So you may need to all gather with pillows and blankets in the room that has the fireplace and close all the rest of the doors, and everyone just pile in and cuddle up under blankets. You don't want to heat the whole house during that time. You want to make sure maybe your pipes don't freeze under the sink, and then you want to make sure everyone's warm and you're gathered in one room. I mean, back in pioneer times, the houses were a lot smaller, and that was one reason why, right? Because it was hard to stay warm, so they all went into a couple of small rooms, and that's it. So if you don't have the option of propane or gas fireplace or a wood heating, then you can use propane or kerosene heaters as an option. So you could keep a propane heater in the garage and just bring it in for emergencies. I just want to caution you that there is a risk of carbon monoxide poisoning, so you have to make sure that it is rated for indoor use, or that you vent your window open when you're using it, which kind of defeats the purpose of heating your room. But just be careful of that aspect, okay? Follow the instructions on the heater. And if you don't have any of these options, you can actually, if you have a tent, if you like camping and you have a small tent, you can put that in your room, say in your living room. So put the tent up, and then everyone sleeps inside the tent, because the tent will actually contain the body heat because it will be in a smaller place. So it's very important that we stay warm. And hand warmers, you know, those hand warmers that you kind of crack and then they warm up your hands and your mittens. If you put those in your 72-hour emergency kit, those can be very comforting and help you feel warm, especially in your extremities. So think about having some hand warmers, because those could come in handy. Now you can do things like make if you have like a terracotta flower pot situation, you can use tea lights, and you can actually make a heater with a flower pot. But I recommend that you go on YouTube and you learn how to do that before an emergency, but that's another option. And a well-supervised candle and or your body heat trapped inside a smaller space can actually provide you heat. If you have a gas generator, of course, you can run your furnace or your heaters, and you normally wouldn't run the generator all night. You would just run it every so often to circulate the heat, but someone has to get up to do that. And generators are noisy, and you need to have gas on hand. Remember that. It's great to have a generator, especially. It's just great to have a generator if you can. They're not super cheap, but I remember after the ice storm, you couldn't buy a generator because they were sold out because suddenly everyone was getting a generator, right? Just a little tip, if you are storing some gas in a jerry can in your garage, don't buy the cheaper gas with the ethanol in it because it won't store well. If you're buying gas for storage, buy like the Premium Supreme or whatever. It doesn't have ethanol in it and it will store longer. And you can also get an additive that you can add to your gasoline to make it store better longer. Let's see here. One thing about if there's the kind of crisis that might result in some rioting or pillaging or looting, if you have a generator, it's so noisy that your neighbors will know that you have a generator. They'll know that you have electricity, and they'll probably know that you have preparation. So that's something to think about with a generator. We can't all afford a solar generator, but that is one advantage of one over the other. I think even just having some gas when you know the price of gas is going to keep going up is a bit of an inflation beater these days. So, yeah. So light is important too, so that you can see what you're doing. And as I said before, it gives a measure of security to your premises. And it can make the crisis seem less scary too, especially for kids. I have so many fond memories from childhood of just playing cards or reading around the table lit by an oil lamp when the power went out, because my parents were quite prepared. So candles, oil lamps, flashlights, and solar lights are all great ways to light your way during a power outage. Of course, if you have a generator, you can power your lights as well while it's on. Please use caution with candles. I like to stock up on affordable tea lights. Like, you can get big packs of them for hardly anything. And if you have some like decorative lanterns with glass, it kind of adds an extra safety measure, and you put the tea lights in there, and it's quite nice to light up an area. So I have also a Uco Candle Lantern. I guess it's in storage, so I couldn't show it to you, but I can show you some of the candles that I have for it. So the Uco Candle Lantern is very portable and light. The lantern glass part pops up, and it has candles that are spring loaded, and so they only go up like over time. So each one of these candles lasts for 9 hours. And you can also, like if you were in your car and you got stuck in a snowstorm and you had to stop, and maybe you ran out of gas, you could actually heat your car with one of those little candle lanterns, as long as you remember to have matches or a lighter to go with it. So that's another thing to put in your 72-hour. This product is from Energizer, and I have a few of these in my home. So you plug it in, and then when the power goes out, it automatically turns on the light. So it's like an emergency lighting system. But then you can also retract this, and you can actually take it out of the plug and use it as a flashlight, and it's always charging, and then the flashlight lasts for about 3 hours, long enough for you to go find your Uco lantern and your oil lamp and so on and so forth. So that's a handy little thing from Energizer. I just got mine on Amazon, but I'm sure you can find them anywhere. Reminder, if you do have oil lamps, which I do have, to also make sure you have wicking and lamp oil, because when it runs out, so you need to be prepared for that. Oh yeah, so I just wanted to say, so my Uco candle lantern, it's not super expensive, but it's kind of a neat thing that you probably wouldn't want to justify buying for yourself necessarily. So we do Christmas gift exchanges in our family, and so I put prepping things on my Christmas list. So one year I put cast iron cookware on my list, and my sister-in-law got my name and she bought me that. And then last year I put the Uco candle lantern on my list, and my brother-in-law got me that. So that's I know Megan's going to talk about prepping on a budget, but that's an extra tip is that, start instead of getting things you don't really need for your birthday or Christmas, why don't you ask your family to get you some things that will help you prep? And this item here, I think Megan has one too. Hers is orange, mine's green. So this is a great gadget. It's about $35. And what it is a solar powered and also hand crank powered. So if there's no sun, you can just wind it up to charge it up. And it has a compass on it, and it's a radio so that you can hear like the emergency weather station and you can know what's going on if you're in a sort of a weather related crisis. Or you can listen to music or something just to help you with your morale during a crisis, or if you're all bored out of your mind because you're so used to technology and screens and everything now. And then the other feature that it has is a flashlight, but it also has a place where you can, a USB port, so that you can actually charge your cell phone from this battery. So for only about $35, you can have a lot of peace of mind for an emergency, right? Because you have your radio, your compass, your light, and you can charge your cell phone. And so that's a good job for the kids, is to be cranking that radio while they have nothing to do. So I recommend getting one of those. That's where I got mine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is communication. So we rely so much on our cell phones these days that many of us, including myself, don't even know our family's phone numbers from memory. So if I needed to call my mom and I didn't have my cell phone working and I was calling her some other way, I don't know if I could tell you what her phone number is off by heart, because I just have her in my contacts and I just put in her name and then, right? But in an emergency, you may need to actually know phone numbers. So that's a good thing to write down. If the power grid goes down, if our phone battery dies and we need to maybe borrow a neighbor's phone to call our family or something like that, it's important that we have a list of their phone numbers, isn't it? We used to memorize them back in the day or have a phone book, but now we don't. So if the cell towers are still working and the internet is working, being able to charge your phone too is so helpful, isn't it? It can keep you connected to your loved ones and to the world. So write down those phone numbers and consider having a physical map of your area, because we're so used to using our GPS now too, right? Or if, say, my sister in London needed to bug out of the city and come to us, which she knows she is welcome to do, usually you would just use your GPS. Well, she'd probably want to take a country route north and west instead of northeast of the city, instead of coming directly through Toronto in a crisis, right? But she might not know that route because that isn't how she usually comes. So having a map or researching the route ahead of time can be very helpful. And it's something we don't think about. I used to have a road atlas that I kept in my car all the time, but now because I have GPS, I don't, right? So sometimes technology can actually be a handicap. There are some phone apps that use what's called a mesh grid. I don't know a whole lot about it, but they can still work when the internet is down. They don't have a big range, but say you're in the subdivision and your kid is over at their friend's house and the internet goes down, there's a cyber attack, but their phones are still charged, but they're not very far away. If you use something like Signal Offline, Signal is an app, and Signal Offline, you can actually still connect with other phones in the area as long as they're not too far away. So research that, and that can be part of your prepping plan. Walkie-talkies can help with communication, and there are also ham radios which bounce off of a satellite and you can text each other. Now, some places have regulations about ham radios that you can't use them. You have to be licensed to use them unless there is an emergency, and that's what you would have it for, is an emergency. So that's another option for communication. I would say that the best communication is just having a plan. So, for example, my mom knows, she lives an hour and a half away, she knows that if there's a prolonged grid down or there's a major crisis, she knows that she's going to come to us, and we have preps waiting for her. I've included her in our preps, and she has a get home bag in her car so she'll be fine. Like, she has some food and water and clothes and running shoes in her car if she needs them. So she knows she's going to come to us. So we've already got that planned out so that it's not, what do I do? And I can't reach my mom, and what's going to happen? We know the plan. She gets in her car. She lives on the edge of the city, so she can get out of the city and get to us, and we'll take care of her. So having a plan with your kids. I don't know about you, but we did fire drills with our kids, and they would have to, whatever they were doing, they would have to go outside and meet by the tree or whatever it was. So it's just important to have a plan, and it's important if you have kids, if you communicate the plan, if you practice the plan, they're not going to be so scared, right? They're going to know, okay, we've been through this, we know what's going on, we know what to do. Cooking, and this goes hand in hand with food. When the power is down, all the modern conveniences that we're used to stop working. So your barbecue is going to be your best friend at this time. Caution, do not use a barbecue indoors, even if it's winter. It's a good idea to have 2 extra tanks in your garage. I wouldn't say I'm there, but I plan to be there once I get actually moved in. Because sometimes your barbecue can even run out in the middle of you making supper. And put your hand up if you've ever experienced that, and it's frustrating, right? So, but for emergencies, a barbecue is a great thing to cook on. And I recommend that you get some cast iron cookware. You can sometimes get it secondhand at thrift stores if it's not in your budget to get it new. You just might need to like re-season it and get some of the rust off and make it usable again. But you can cook on a campfire or on a barbecue or in your fire pit if you have cast iron. And if you have a cast iron Dutch oven, I didn't bring mine today, but you can actually bake bread in a cast iron Dutch oven right in the coals of a fire. So, you know, we all may not have all the gadgetry in the world, but, you know, if we can scrounge some firewood and we have cast iron or we have a barbecue, we can cook for our family. And so we're talking about power outages now, not just 72 hours. So it might be longer than 72 hours, and you might need to start cooking up some of your preps. You can also purchase a simple portable camping stove. So Megan has an example of one here. This is so cute, I want this. Just to be clear, I'm not coveting Megan's. I want to go buy myself one, but it's a cute little camp stove, and it has little fuel kind of tabs, I guess, that are already in here ready to go. And it's only this big. Isn't that amazing? So if you think that I have no room for preps, well, you have room for this. So that's just from Coghlan, so you can get it anywhere that you get camping supplies. And it's just a little stove. You can also get one, because that one requires specific little fuel tabs, I guess, but you can get around $35. I don't have one yet, but it's on my list. I have an Amazon list of next preps, which are things that I want to get. A camping stove, and it actually folds up and then it unfolds, and you can use like crumbled up newspapers, sawdust, twigs that you find, leaves, whatever. You can put anything in it and it's very portable because it's for camping. So that's an idea that can work as well for you. Yeah, just make sure if you're counting on your barbecue that you have extra propane. And if you're bugging out, it is hard to cook. So just keep that in mind when if you decide to bug out. But something like that will help a little. Oh, I didn't mention this, but I wanted to mention it. I had this tea here to remind myself. If you're used to drinking coffee or tea every day, or if you find a cup of tea like relaxing, that is something to have in your emergency preps. Like, as long as you can heat up some water in a crisis, wouldn't it be nice to just sit with a cup of tea and not be stressed out? So, and if you're used to having coffee every day and you rely on that caffeine, a crisis is not the time to also go through caffeine withdrawal, right? So you can get instant coffee, it's freeze dried and then it lasts. And if you're trying to be light, like in a bug out bag, you can always get the like little Starbucks packages or other freeze dried packages, and then they're also very light. You will need hot water for them, but it really can provide you with some comfort, just like those snacks and treats can, right, in a time of crisis. And so then you might also want to add some sugar or something like that. I keep powdered milk in my 72-hour because I have water as well, and so then I can just make milk, but it won't go bad in the meantime. And there should also be, you should also have cash for an emergency, and specifically in your 72-hour emergency, you should actually have physical cash in small bills. It doesn't have to be a lot, but if you need to buy some gas for the generator and the power's out, and so the stores rely on power for all their debit and credit machines and everything else, if you have some cash, you could still buy something that you need, right? If they're even open. I was at the bank yesterday to make a deposit, and the power was out at the bank, so they couldn't help me or do anything for me at all. They couldn't do it manually. They were just locked down. And so what if I didn't have any money and then I needed to do a withdrawal, but the power was out and I couldn't even get to the bank? So it's important to just have some cash on hand. And they recommend smaller bills so that because people can't always make you change, or they might not have change. So you don't want to give them a 50 for something that only costs 20 and then you're out $30 because they can't give you change, right? So 5s and 10s are a good idea for that. And then this is not for 72 hours only, but having an emergency fund is very important. So at the beginning of the pandemic, my income went to zero as a small business owner because of lockdowns, and my husband was laid off. So our income went to zero. If we hadn't had an emergency fund, we could have lost our house, right? And we ended up using it all up. So it's just very important to have that. And I haven't built it all back up again, but I plan to, because we need to be prepared for emergencies, right? And finally, entertainment. And this sounds like a silly thing to have when the power goes out or in a short-term emergency, but we are somewhat of an entertained generation, and we're used to having our Netflix and everything like that, our YouTube videos, and that's how we learn to do everything, YouTube. So having, some cards, Uno cards, of course. No, just kidding. I had to say that. Some of you know what I'm saying. Some board games, things like that can really make, especially in a power outage, can really make that time be fun and memorable in a good way. And also it will distract the kids from any fears that they might have in the situation. And it may give you more time to play board games with them, because you can't really do anything else if you're prepared, right? All right, so are there any questions about all that I shared? I know it's a lot. Did I forget anything? Megan? All right, yeah. So I'm just gonna look at my table for a second and see if there's anything that I thought of. Oh, this is in terms of long-term preparedness, but I just wanted to mention it in case some of you don't know this, but I have some seeds on the table. I found this out when I was going to buy some seeds for my brother-in-law for Christmas, because he loves gardening. That's something we have in common, and I thought it would bless him. And I couldn't find any seeds anywhere. So apparently all the seed companies actually remove all the seeds from the stores at the end of the season. And I understand why, because they don't want you like buying year-old seeds and then they don't have as good a germination rate and so on and so forth. So it makes sense. But if you think that you're going to grow some of your own food, if there's a long-term crisis or just because of the inflation that we're experiencing. You need to get your seeds before the end of the season, even if you pack them away for next year in an airtight container. Just know that you can't always get seeds. And so more than ever, it's important to have some if that's something that you're going to rely on for long-term storage. And we can talk more about long-term storage another time because this is 72 hours and power outages. So no questions? Does anyone have a prepping tip for 72 hours or power outages that I might not have thought of or mentioned? I didn't specifically mention have some firewood on hand. I was looking at one of our firewood sellers and it reminded me to say that it's important to have firewood. Even just a little stack of campfire wood. Even if you don't have campfires regularly, it can't hurt to have it just in case you need to cook on it. No questions? Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Megan then, and she's going to share with us about prepping on a budget. And I've also asked her just to talk a little bit about her bug out bag because that's more her expertise, although I am inspired by it, and so I hopefully will be making one soon.
Are you overwhelmed yet, or is this, we're good? Oh, perfect. Okay. So most of you know me. My name is Megan, and so I am living here in town. And I don't know, like looking at you, I think most of you probably live closer to a similar situation as what Rowan is living in, with a bit of property, a bigger house, and some space to kind of move around with and work with. So, but that's not my situation. So I don't know if this will speak to some of you, but hopefully it will. So we have a family of 5, and we live in a small house, a townhouse in town. At our jobs, we make enough to pay the bills, and have some fun with. We do some fun things together, but we don't necessarily have a ton of money to spend huge amounts on preparing for emergencies all at once. So for example, the Berkey, I love it. It's amazing. I'm not at the place where I've saved enough money for that yet. So one day maybe, but not yet. So we also don't have yard space for a huge garden. We're completely dependent on the town water, sewer, and electricity. So we don't have our own well. We don't have, our own septic system or anything like that. So when our kids were little, we had little to no margin in our budget. So I would often use tactics like what I'm about to talk about to build up our supply of what I called our poor food. And I mean no disrespect at all by using that term. That's what we called it. So the poor food was the stored food that we had that we would dip into when there wasn't enough money to buy groceries that week. And maybe it wasn't our favorite food, but it was food that we knew we would eat and we could depend on, and that it would be there. And so that was just inexpensive canned goods and pantry items with a long shelf life, so that it was there when we needed it. So you might be in the same boat. There are many reasons why the cost of preparing for the emergencies that we've been talking about might make it feel impossible, like it might seem overwhelming, like where do we get all this money to even get started? So you might be thinking that I don't actually have much margin in my regular monthly budget. So I've got some secrets and some ideas that I'm going to share with you that will help you stretch your dollar. And you might also be worried about investing so much in something you may not use. And I think Rowan addressed that perfectly when she said, if you're wrong, you can just eat your mistakes. But if you don't have mistakes to eat, then you're stuck. So we're also going to talk about creating a working pantry that allows you to use up what you're storing as you replace it. You may also be not completely convinced that prepping is necessary. So if our supply chain issues haven't already convinced you, the lockdowns, the inflation, the empty shelves, the lack of baby formula haven't convinced you, President Biden also has said that food shortages are going to get real, and we're seeing that happen. The Canadian press says Canadian families will spend almost $1,000 more in groceries this year. And food bank usage, and we see that here with Free Food Friday, food bank usage is on the rise. There's more and more people who are experiencing food insecurity. They don't know how they're going to make rent. They cut back on groceries, and they don't have enough to eat. So even without all of the economic factors and the world events and all of that stuff, Flooding happens in Angus a lot, and many of you, I'm sure, have experienced that in past years. And tornadoes are a thing around here. We've had one come through our neighborhood, and just the other year, last year, I guess it was, in Barrie. And so things like those are all situations that we need to be prepared for. So I've been able to put together some systems and some hacks that have allowed us to come up with a 72-hour plan, as well as plans for longer-term sheltering in place and bugging out that I'm hoping you're going to find helpful and at a reasonable cost. And I also know that it's really easy to become overwhelmed once you start doing the research, watching YouTube videos and gathering supplies, and maybe possibly over shopping. So if we're doing this on a budget, we want to make sure that we're spending our money wisely, because it won't do anyone any good to be prepared for the future and not have enough for today. So I'm going to take a drink of water. And then I'm going to share with you what my principles of low-cost prepping are. So here's the basic principles, the basic ideas that I've built my emergency preparedness plan on. So the first one is store what you use what you store. The second one is use what you have, which means you don't need special equipment. The third one is to have a multiplicity of approaches, which is a fun way to say prepare for various situations so that we can stretch our dollar and make sure we're using our dollar effectively. And then the fourth one is the necessity of redundancy, which is preparing for several solutions to each problem. So let's take a closer look at the first principle. Store what you use and use what you store. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is to plan our preps based on what our family already eats and uses. So if your family doesn't eat beans, even though beans are a wonderful thing to have in your pantry, don't include them in your plan. If you're not going to eat them, don't buy them. There's no point. And at the same time, take allergies and food sensitivities into consideration. Plan to include whatever diapers and personal hygiene products and medications and eye care and all of those sorts of things that might be specific to your family. Plan to include those as well. Another aspect that we want to keep in mind is that we're planning for today and then tomorrow. So there are two ways to store your 72-hour supply. One is in a separate container that will store for long term. And Rowan has a bucket right here that is completely packaged, and that's all the food that I'm not sure if it's a family or an individual, but whoever would need for the 72 hours. So you can do it that way. But then a solution that tends to be a little bit more budget friendly is to use what I call a working pantry, which is a pantry that, just like you are using on a regular basis in your kitchen, and it's food that's in continual rotation, but we've added to it and increased it so that it could last us a long period of time without doing extra shopping. So, like I said, that's the most budget-friendly way to start with 72 hours worth of food, is through a working pantry. So that's what we're going to be talking about going forward. Things like our non-edible items, so like our radios and our flashlights and chargers, our solar chargers, all of that fun stuff, those cool technology things and gadgets, we can just add those as the money becomes available. Because we're talking about doing this on a budget, we want to focus on food and water. Those are the essentials. So something that we can do, and we can start this the next time we go shopping, is just adding 1 or 2 extra things each shopping trip as your budget allows. So for example, for our family, we eat a ton of canned corn, for better or for worse. We just all like it. So when it's on sale, I buy 1 or 2 extra, 1 and 2 more than what we need. And I do the same thing with pasta and tomato sauce. So Walmart right now has a great deal on tomato sauce, and it's jars of tomato sauce, good brand. And so I bought some extra when I was ordering. And so that while we're doing that, we want to make sure also that we're deciding in advance how much extra we can spend. So we're still spending a reasonable amount. We're not getting carried away. So even $20 each shopping trip can buy you a reasonable amount of food as long as you're choosing wisely. So we want to start also with basics. Start with rice, pasta, beans, vegetables, things like that are staples, and they give you the most calories for your dollar. So one of the most cost-effective, inexpensive, filling, and calorie-dense foods is pasta and sauce. So spaghetti or rotini or whatever your favorite pasta is, and sauce. And for many of us, it's also comfort food. So as long as we have access to cooking and water, to have pasta and tomato sauce on hand is a great way to fill out that pantry. So rice is another great thing. So we've got rice that's already ready to go, ready to eat, and that's great for when we don't have hydro or we don't have cooking or fresh water. If we do, we can always keep on hand just regular. The best kind is just long grain white rice, and there's a huge bag of it over there. And super cheap, lots of calories, and it's a great way to add to your pantry for the least amount of dollars. So canned meats, which we all like to make fun of Spam, but things like Spam and tuna and canned chicken are inexpensive. Those are things that you can be adding to your working pantry and rotating through as long as your family already eats them. If your family doesn't already eat them, don't stock them. But if they do, that's a great thing to build up a supply of. Canned fruits and veggies. So fresh obviously is best, but fresh obviously also does not last very long in your refrigerator, in your kitchen. So having a supply of canned on hand is always good as well. And then of course, as we're talking about food, even more essential than food is water. So my recommendation is to make sure that you're buying extra water every single time you go shopping. So I've got a 4-liter jug over here, and that's $1.08 at Walmart. And you'll probably be able to find it cheaper at other places. You could find bigger containers for cheaper. Or if you go through like 2-liter bottles of pop, you can easily repurpose those with just tap water and be storing that to build up your supply of water. So like I said, we don't have a well, so finding ways to make sure that we've got water on hand is important. Okay, so and then we also want to remember that it's important to be realistic and not perfect. So in a real emergency, we will just want food, not a huge 3-course dinner with candlelight. So like a spaghetti dinner without Caesar salad is still a very filling dinner. And while getting several daily servings of fruits and veggies is amazing, it's the goal, it's wonderful day to day, in the middle of a crisis, it's not realistic to expect that to be happening. So if you choose to go the budget-friendly route of building your 72-hour supply through a working pantry, you'll find that you can do it quite quickly. And my guess is many of you actually already have this in your house. And so if you just keep doing these things going forward, you're going to have a 2-week supply in no time, and you could just keep going, right? Just keep building up that supply. Obviously, that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but it's easy to see how quickly it can snowball into being so much better prepared, even though you're not spending a ton of money all at once. And then once you have necessities and things that will get you through whatever crisis, then you can start to add some of the nice to have things that aren't just necessities. So things like cake mixes and juice crystals to make your bottled water taste a little bit better. You can start to add those to your pantry as you're able to. All right, so the next one is use what you have. So once you start down the rabbit trail of prepping, you may quickly become overwhelmed with the vacuum sealers, food-grade buckets, Mylar bags, dehydrators, other equipment that people use. So when we're prepping on a budget, though, we should be focusing on using what we already have. So just ignore all that other fancy stuff. Use or buy food that you either already have in your pantry or that is already packaged for long shelf life. So canned things and freeze-dried. Pasta, rice, and beans, like we've been talking about. It's not fancy, but it stores a good long time on its own with no special packaging or no special treatment. Canned fruits and veggies and meats, dried fruits, raisins, and dates, again, they don't last quite as long, but they'll last longer than fresh. One of my tricks is to buy in smaller packages rather than in bulk packages. So then if you open it, you don't have to use your entire supply all at once. And if one goes bad for whatever reason, or if mice get into a package, the rest of your packaging is safe and you can still continue to use them. The other thing that you can do is with a smaller bag of rice, not like my 8-kilogram bag over there. You have smaller packages of rice if a neighbor needs them, or a can of fruit or whatever. It's very easy to be able to share that with your neighbor, right, and help them out, and without having to repackage. So speaking of my 8-kilogram bag of rice, that's super cheap. Like I said, it's great to buy it like that. I will repackage it so that it is in the smaller packages. And of course, check your shelves for these things. You might already have some of what you need. And then as far as the non-edible supplies that we've been talking about, things like flashlights and candles and matches and lighters and blankets and first aid, all of the things that Rowan was talking about, and where you can buy them, chances are you already have a number of these things already in your household. So if you can buy special equipment to set aside for your 72-hour kit, your 72-hour plan, that's amazing. If you don't, just shop your home. Just see what you have and pull it together and set it aside in a specific container or on a shelf where you know where you can access it when you need to, when the lights go out. So when we're prepping on a budget, we need to keep various scenarios in mind. So we're only talking about the first 72 hours today, but because we're being budget conscious, it means that we'll always have an eye to the other uses for our supplies. So that's where our multiplicity of approaches comes in. So when we're trying to stretch our dollar, we want to make sure that we're keeping various situations in mind. So, for example, we may be sheltering in place with hydro and water, and that's what happens when we're quarantined, when we're locked down, right? We're stuck in our homes, and we have to make do with what we have, barring curbside and delivery and all of that stuff. But we have hydro and water, so that's great. That's ideal. We may be sheltering in place without hydro and water. So friends of ours in Gravenhurst just this winter, for whatever reason, the water treatment plant was out of order and they had no water. So what do you do? In their situation, we were just talking to them. We said, well, why didn't you just go outside, get snow off the ground and melt it? And they said there was no snow on the ground. So then I said, well, no problem. You guys have a beach nearby. You have a nice big lake. You could just go down there and grab some water. They said, no, the ice was too thick. We would have needed a chainsaw. And of course, they didn't have a chainsaw. And so they didn't have any water stored up. They had to depend on the town to then truck in water. So, I mean, that's a very recent situation that kind of just opened my eyes to the idea that, no, I can't necessarily depend on, using snow, melting snow in the winter, or whatever other kinds of ideas I might have had. Having water on hand, bottled water, is always a good thing. So then the other situations that you may encounter are bugging out with your own vehicle or bugging out without your own vehicle. And so if you're bugging out with your own vehicle, maybe that's because your basement has flooded, and because of electrical and whatever, you need to leave and go stay at a friend's house. And bugging out without your own vehicle is like in the situation of the tornado that came through Angus, where people's cars were destroyed and they had to leave their homes, and they weren't allowed to return until they got the all clear. So we want to make sure that we're considering all of these possibilities and using our money to check as many boxes as possible. So preparing for several solutions to each problem stretches our dollar and makes our dollar go as far as possible. So then, along the same lines is the fourth principle, which is the necessity of redundancy. So this is preparing for several solutions to each problem. So for our water, we want to make sure that we have lots of ways to deal with a lack of water. So if we don't have, or let's say we do have tap water and we need to boil it. If we've got a stove, an oven that we can be boiling water to clean it so that it's drinkable, that's great. But we also want to make sure that we have some backup plans in place. So we might have bottled water. We might have a filter like a Berkey or a Life Straw or a water drop. We also want to make sure that we've got purification tablets, and so that we've got different ways to take care of the essential water problem, because like Rowan said, you don't last long without water. And then food. We want to make sure that we've got all of the various raw ingredients. So like I said, rice is something that you should have in supply in your house. But if you don't have water or a method to cook it, you've got to make sure that you've got some stuff that's ready to eat as well. And conversely, we want to make sure that we've got stuff that we can make with just water. So warmth, we also want to make sure that there's several options that we have to draw on to keep ourselves and our families warm. So we might have a wood stove, but if you're like me and you live in a townhouse, there's no way we're going to have a wood stove in our townhouse. So we make sure that we've got sleeping bags, we've got lots of warm clothes. We could easily do the tent trick like Rowan was talking about. We may have a generator. We personally don't, but that's another option as well. And then cooking. We were talking about a barbecue, camp stove, backpacking stove. Your fire pit in your backyard is a great option, but failing all of that, make sure that you've got food that's ready to eat, like our can of chili over there. And then shelter, of course. So if we're sheltering in our house, that's ideal, that's perfect, that's great. If we need to leave, like when there's a tornado and we're forced to leave our house, where are we going to go? And having a plan, so if you've got a cottage or a trailer that you can go to, great. If you've got a friend or a relative's house that you can go to, or a neighbor's, or even the option of having some money tucked aside for paying for a hotel room is a good way to be prepared. So keeping all of this stuff in mind is essential to getting the most out of our money. So, for example, like Rowan mentioned earlier, eating a cold can of beans, it's not appetizing at all, but when you're hungry, it does the trick. It fills your belly, and it solves the problem of not having clean water or a means to cook. So my favorite places to buy low-cost preps are Dollar Tree, Dollarama, and No Frills. And at the same time, we need to watch our prices, because the can of beans for $1.25 at Dollar Tree might actually be 97 cents at No Frills. So we still want to make sure that we're checking our prices and price shopping. So after shopping our own homes, and I'm going to show you a few things over here, we're going to take a look at what we can purchase on a low budget. So the key that we want to keep in mind is to keep the per serving cost as low as possible, or another way to think about it is to keep the per calorie cost as low as possible. So I am going to walk over here. Is it okay if I take this microphone? Okay. Oh, right. All right, it's still on, right? Yeah, okay. All right, so I've got these items on this table kind of grouped by where we got them. So any grocery store is great. I don't know about you guys, but I found that No Frills is a lot cheaper than Sobeys here in town. So that tends to be where I go. But again, if you have time to shop sales, then this is ideal. But when we're preparing, we want to make sure, of course, that we have things that we know that we're going to use, the consumables, and we want to, like I said, get as good a deal as possible. So we all know how important this is, right? Not many of us want to go too long without toilet paper, and we've discovered how people hoard that. So when I'm doing my regular grocery shop on my regular budget, getting extra toilet paper is always something I do, and one of the best places to get it is No Frills. It's cheap, and it has the 3-ply, so it's like spoiling myself, but it's a good thing. You can get it cheaper there as well. And of course, things like rice, pasta, all of those things, No Frills has great deals on. I don't want to trip here. So we've got like applesauce and juice boxes and meat sticks. These are great for your 72-hour kit. All of this stuff, oh, mashed potatoes, that's with water, of course, but this stuff is great for your 72-hour kit. And for me personally, the way I work our 72-hour plan is that I'm checking it on a regular basis to see if anything has, gone bad or whatever. So things like applesauce and juice is a great idea. If you're going for more of a long-term storage, like having your buckets set aside, this wouldn't work, but for us it does. So cans of soup like this, when these go on sale, this is great because, well, you will need a can opener, so make sure you have that. They're ready to eat right out of the can. And for me, I'm not big on eating beans, so something like this is a little bit better for someone like me. And then, of course, ramen, super cheap, very filling. It's maybe not the most gourmet meal, but if you're hungry, it will fill your belly. Cup of soup, and there's some tea here as well. So I've got mint tea. This is like one of my comfort items, and if I have clean water that I can boil, that's perfect. So that's, we've also got fruit bars. These are super cheap. This is, I don't even know, there's 30 in here. I think it was about $10. So each of these fruit bars is about 120 calories, I believe, and they've got like a serving of fruit in them. So that's another way to make sure that you're getting your fruits and veggies and getting those vitamins that you need. And then granola bars, that's another good snack item. So then Dollar Tree. Dollarama is great. Dollar Tree is better. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, that's good. So so for ready to eat, these packages of rice are completely ready to go. You can stick them in your microwave and warm them up. You might even be able to boil them in the bag, but you can also just open them up and get out a spoon and eat them straight out of there. So in an emergency, those are awesome. They also have these wonderful little chicken salad and cracker kits, and that's, I want to say it's also 230 calories. So that's a good amount if you're in a crisis situation. That's good to set aside. Crackers, we've got oats. This, well, we opened it, but it's a bag of oats, quick oats for $1.25 or so. Well, it's a Dollar Tree, so $1.25. And then there's your beans. These packages, if you eat beans, are great for sticking in your 72-hour kit. Because same thing, right? You can just rip them open and eat them straight up. These ones, of course, you don't even need a can opener to open. So there's lots of other goodies that you can get as far as food goes. These, I should mention these. These are just little flavor crystals for your bottled water. So if you've got bottled water that you've bought, that's great. If you're having to purify your water, either through a Life Straw, water drop, whatever, or with purification tablets, it's gonna taste gross, right? Like if you have kids, they won't like it. So having flavor crystals to just kind of mask that flavor, it'll be safe, but it won't taste, having these to mask it will really help. And then for the non-food products, like I've been saying, shop your home, but if you can't find things at home, you can easily find things at the dollar store that will do you just fine. And then maybe you want to upgrade when there's a little bit more room in the budget, but until then, these work just great. So 72-hour kit, you should always have gloves in there, right? In case of have whatever kind of work you have to do with your hands. Having a rain poncho, also good. Candles. Oh, these ones are $1.50. These candles are awesome because they're already in their own glass container. They last forever. Maybe not forever, but I also was able to find some of these. These are sternos that you put under chafing dishes. But if you needed a source of heat or to cook or to warm up by, these would be nice and easy to use and in their own containers. And what else? Oh, we've got like enamel metal cups. These ones you can stick right in a flame, right, to warm up a cup of water, to boil it, to purify it, or to just make a cup of coffee or whatever you need to make. So that's, and quinoa, that's at the Dollar Tree, right? So there's lots of options, and it's great to kind of take your time and just kind of stroll through the aisles and see what you can get that is, first of all, that's ready to eat, because that's perfect, that's ideal, ready to go. If you can't find that, or to kind of as a side or as another option, finding things that will take just water, that's a great idea. So then I'm going to, we're going to take a look at what you can find around your house. So let's see. Okay. Some of these are special equipment that you would need to purchase specifically for this kind of a situation. So this is my Grail. This is a water purifier, and this has like literally saved my stomach so many times because it is a coffee press style water filter. So you just put the water in, you press down, and it cleans the water as it goes with this fancy filter. And I don't know if you guys have heard anything about the water on remote reserves in Ontario, but it's terrible for you. Oh man, it's awful. You don't want to go there. So I can tell you for sure that this really works. This is a little bit more expensive. Something like this, a water drop, is great. It's $22, $23 on Amazon. And you can attach a bottle of dirty water here, squeeze it, and filter it out into a clean container down below. So a life straw you may be familiar with, you have to actually put your mouth on it and put it in the puddle of water or the lake or whatever it is that you're drinking out of. This one you don't have to do that, so that's kind of nice. And that's a great, that's a great budget way to get water filtration going. So I think that's it. Oh, and then, yeah, water purification tablets. Again, that's something you can get on Amazon. A package like this does 50 liters of water, and it is about $10. So, on Amazon. So around your house, though, things that you can be looking for to stock are sleeping bags, backpack to keep things in, that sort of thing. Also, all of your first aid stuff. We've all got like bottles of ibuprofen or Tylenol or antibiotic ointment at home. If you're not in a place where you can be spending the money to stock those things brand new, just grab your extra tubes and whatever from around the house or from your bathroom first aid kit or whatever, and put them in with your 72-hour kit. And just have that in a place where you'll know where it is and you can get it if needed. Okay, so today we've been talking about our 72-hour supply. And for those of us who've been in a situation where sheltering in place is not an option in an emergency, you will want to include the possibility of evacuation, of bugging out, like we've been talking about, as part of your 72-hour plan. So for our family, it is part of our 72-hour plan. So, and like we were talking about, Angus experienced a tornado several years ago, and because we were so close to that situation, I think that's kind of like stuck in my mind, that that's something we need to be prepared for, is to just, without anything else, to be able to grab what we need and leave immediately. So that's what we've done. So we have backpacks just like this one for each member of our family, and they sit on a shelf by our front door in our townhouse. And they're color-coded for each member of the family. They're literally designed to be just grabbed and run with. So they're completely self-contained in case we get split up. Everybody has their own food, their own water, their own water purification, their own life straws. We've included everything that you could possibly need except for shoes and clothing. That's the only thing we haven't been able to fit in there. But we also have things like ID, photocopies of passports, things like that in there as well. So that's something, if that's something you're, that's kind of rattling around in your mind, that possibility, that would be a good thing to prepare for as well, and to set up your own evacuation bag. So as Rowan mentioned when we began, preparing for emergency situations isn't about being afraid or worrying about what could happen. It's about anticipating needs before they happen and being prepared for whatever comes our way so that we don't need to worry or be afraid, and so that we're taking care of ourselves, not being a burden to others, so that we can extend help to our friends and neighbors. So thank you.
Thanks, Megan. So I was thinking when you were talking about how you're building your preps little by little in these affordable ways, there's a prepping saying which is one is none and two is one. And that's like if you just have one of something, it's in a prepping sense, it's like you have none. But if you have two, then you have one. So that's just a little something you can have in your head when you're in the cans section of the grocery store or in the Dollar Tree. I agree with you. I got my rice at the Dollar. And so if you're watching online or on TV or wherever this video is being shown, you can go to pinewoodschapel.com and you can find us there.